My name's Jonathan Rosenblum. I'm a columnist in Israel and the author of 12 or 13 books, I'm not exactly sure. This is 18 questions from 40 Israeli thinkers for 1840.
We'll begin where we always do. As an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history?
This very moment, it fluctuates so quickly that it's very hard to tell. If you asked me on Thursday night a week ago, I was exhilarated and frightened. If you asked me on Motzei Shabbos, pretty excited. If you ask me right now, I'm a little bit confused. I don't know what this ceasefire is about. It seems to me that there are a lot of open-ended questions that haven't been resolved yet, like what to do with what have the Iranians agreed to do with respect to their nuclear program, and I guess all that's sort of hidden. I don't know what discussions have gone on, and there were no news reports of any discussions between Iran and the United States. So, as usual, everything here is always on a boil, and so fluctuating. My mood is fluctuating, but generally good. I mean, in general, over the past, we have seen a large-scale destruction of Iran's capabilities, and we've seen basically the noose that was around Israel's neck for the last 15 years of this ring of fire of enemies committed to our destruction and at the service of Iran has been largely removed for the time being. Hamas still remains a problem in Gaza, but not as a threat to the rest of Israel. How to deal with that problem remains an open question, or what the result will be there. But in general, the mood in Israel probably right now is pretty optimistic.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's always changing. You mentioned the Israel-Hamas war. What do you think has been Israel's greatest success and greatest mistake in that war against Hamas?
The greatest mistake is that it took place at all. I mean, the greatest mistake, nothing will ever match, I pray, in Israeli history, nothing will ever match the intelligence failure of October 7th.
But in terms of the war itself, meaning once the war had already
Okay, I'm
progressed.
not a military strategist, but it seems to me that we have finally settled upon a strategy that makes some sense, which is a recognition that you can only achieve your goals if you hold territory. You cannot simply bomb and leave. You have to, whatever Israel is going to achieve there can only be done with respect by holding territory. I mean, the Philadelphia corridor has got to remain in our hands. The the Erez crossing has got to remain in our hands, and there has to be a large separation between the Palestinian population of Gaza and the communities in the Otef Gaza, in the Gaza envelope. Um, Certainly, I think that the idea of delivering food directly under non-Hamas auspices obviously scares Hamas a great deal, and rightly so, because it takes away their control over the population. Um,
But in terms of success and mistake of the war itself, what would you say are those greatest?
well, that's the success, is having settled upon a strategy now,
Uh-huh.
which I think does have potential to lead to some resolution. Failure, I'm not a military strategist, so it's very hard for me to say what's the greatest failure. That it's taken a long time, yes. Could it have been pursued alternatively? I really don't know. Um, uh, I think that Netanyahu faced a lot of opposition, and this has been an ongoing problem, that the the general staff remains very left oriented and opposed
General staff of.
of the IDF, and I think he had a recalcitrant uh, army chief of staff. He, I think that's less true today. The present chief of staff seems to be more in line with thinking in terms of how do we actually win this war and finish it.
Why
Um,
do you say he was recalcitrant?
because that's just been the the uh, the whole inclination to think that we can somehow always reach some kind of accommodation where there may not be an accommodation.
Accommodation of.
Accommodation with Hamas, or Hamas that somehow will reach some understanding. And the truth of the matter is, and this is something that Einat Filth just talked about recently, is we have to restore terms like victory and defeat, because until there's something that resembles victory, then there's no possibility of any change in the mindset of the Palestinian population. Until you, the real aim of the war, the ultimate goal of the war would be to get Palestinians in Gaza to recognize that they have no future by trying to get rid of Israel, and to see what they could build for themselves in tandem with Israel, or living adjacent to Israel.
So I was actually going to ask, what would victory look like to you?
Well, victory, first of all, would look like Hamas has lost its control. They've lost their control of the education system. And that's a big thing. The education system is a big thing. As a friend of mine, David Badin, has been talking about for years, UNRWA, if you look at the curriculum that is foisted upon Palestinian children, it's a jihad curriculum. And that's something that has to be changed. You can't... It's very hard to imagine that anytime in the near future we're going to live in peaceful coexistence with people who have been whipped into a frenzy of hatred for Israel. This is already a 100-year war. This is not it's not a war that started yesterday. The inability, the unwillingness to accept Israel's existence is the ultimate problem. And I don't know that it has. That within Islam there's a solution for it. There's a concept of Dar al-Islam, land that belonged to the Muslim people. Anything that ever was in their control somehow becomes sacrosanct, and that any interloper should ever come in and have part of that land is simply unacceptable. That attitude has got to change to some extent. And I think the Abraham Accords are an example of losing patience with that. I don't know what the theological changes in Saudi Arabia or the three states that signed on to the Abraham Accords are, but there has to be some change in that mentality.
In a more personal sense, how have your religious views changed since October 7th?
I couldn't identify any ways in which I think they've changed. I think there's a certain strengthening of them in the sense of seeing. Look at it. On October 7th itself, it's a disaster. It takes place on Simchas Torah. It's a shock to the system. But what we learned is that when you're talking about Hashem's hashgacha in the world, you always have to have a broader perspective. Your perspective cannot be limited to a particular event. And in that sense, you see that the biggest disaster in Israel's history, the worst single day in Israel's history, has been followed by a complete transformation of the Middle East in our favor. The lessening of the threat which Hezbollah was holding over us. I wrote a column right after October 7th, and I pointed out that we're facing threats all around. This is only the beginning of something that could be much worse. That at that time, Hezbollah had 130,000, estimated between 100 and 150,000 missiles, many of them precision. You hit the oil depots in Haifa, you could set off a fireball that would consume much of the city. There were so many disaster scenarios. They were projecting at that time 300 missiles a day from Hezbollah if Hezbollah entered into a full-time into a real war, and we were completely, we would have been on multiple fronts. That's so the situation appeared very, very grave, very frightening. And today, it looks a lot better.
So in those moments where it seemed like things were particularly dire, and they actually were dire and dangerous, did your faith or religiosity waver or be challenged in any way? And if so, how did you respond to that? Or I guess let me ask it differently. How did your faith and religiosity respond to those moments?
just a repetition of the messages that you understand. I'm about tshuva. I started at a late stage. Just repeating the message that Hashem is running the show there. That we are His people. I'm also a student of Jewish history, and I'm sympathetic to Rabbi Yaakov Emden's statement that the survival of the Jewish people alone is as great a miracle as Yetzias Mitzrayim. That this is not an accident that we've survived, and we've only survived that Hashem has somehow preserved us as a single lamb among 70 wolves for 2,000 years of Gullus, and that is the miracle, and that we will continue to partake of that miracle. But of course, there's a lot of suffering along the way. I mean, the Holocaust happened. Your grandchildren, children, and grandchildren are under threat. There are missiles coming in. There's, there. As I told my wife the other day, we've been here 46 years. We've lived through a lot. We've lived through a lot of wars. We've lived through the Gulf War in 1991, where we were talking about gas, poison gas coming in. You had to seal up your room, and in much more intense way than we've done right now. So in some ways, it was even scarier than the missiles coming in now. Though they certainly weren't equal in size. But I don't think I had a major theological change.
That makes sense. What has the last year and a half or so been like for the Haredi community in general? I know it's hard. It's a big question.
No, well, I think the biggest change is, the army issue is a big issue, and it's become a much bigger issue in the last year and a half because there were stories that everybody told themselves, not just the Karedi. The secular Israelis said, the army, it would be too much of a bother to bring in all the Haredi. We don't need them because the wars of the future will be fought by drones and robots and high tech. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in a war in which a 7-front war because Judea and Samaria are also a threat and right on our border, besides Gaza, besides Lebanon. And so even the secular population thought, we don't really need them. And the Haredim always told themselves, so they don't need us, so we'll go on as before. I mean, it was always been a contentious issue, but it hasn't been one that seemed like it was fundamental to Israel's existence. But today we've seen, in the last 18 months or 19 months, we've seen manpower shortages. I mean, you can't say it's not a manpower shortage when married men have to be in the army for 200 to 300 days, and the disruption in lives of those in the reserves, especially in the national religious community. So there's a need for rethinking where we stand. I mean, because I think there is a large segment of the Haredi population which wants to be part of Israel too, and even feels traditionally the Haredi population took the position we're under siege and we always have to draw the wagons closer. But that was in 1948. We're not in that situation today. There is not, the community is simply too large to be gotten rid of. When Ben-Gurion and the Chazon Ish met, it was possible for Ben-Gurion to think that within one generation, who cares about a yeshiva deferment? They'll be all gone anyhow, besides a small pocket of people in Mea Shearim. There'll be nothing left. The future is all ours. And that turned out not to be the case. And, as the Haredi population gains confidence, it also wants to be a participant. It also wants to have a say in the future of the country. I mean, there was an astounding statistic came out 2 weeks ago. I think it was from the Israel Democracy Institute, a study that showed between 18 and 29, a majority of Israelis between 18 and 29 are Shomer Shabbos.
So we'll return to the specific question of Haredim and the army and the draft in a little bit. But I'm curious, setting the draft aside, how has the Haredi community responded to October 7th, not necessarily in an action-oriented way, but in terms of the way that events like these and tragedies like these hit people and change
Well,
communities.
first of all, it's almost impossible to ask a question about the Haredi community. I mean, the idea that the Haredi community is some kind of monolith is the first thing you have to get rid of. It's by no means monolithic. I mean, one thing that the Haredim have always been very good at is chesed. You know, I have a daughter in Ramat Beit Shemesh who's been cooking for soldiers from the beginning of the war, of taking care of. There's all kinds of things. Another friend in Ramat Beit Shemesh, Eliezer Friedman, who's raised close to 10. He has 10,000 soldiers who have put on tefillin and taken, purchased tefillin for 10,000 soldiers. That's a $4.5 million project. They've been very, very active. Mostly, I don't think it's changed well, as again, I can't speak for a
Yeah, of
monolithic
course, of
community.
course.
I live here in Harnof. Harnof is largely English speaking. It makes it it's a different community. And sometimes I think I really don't know the community in other places, that I really don't know what's going on in Bnei Brak. Sometimes I hear statements by some Haredi spokesman that I just seem to me, I don't identify with them at all. So it's impossible to make a statement about that. I mean, we're all shaken. It was impossible to open up the newspapers at the beginning of the war in Gaza and see soldiers who had, see these beautiful Jewish faces of soldiers who had been killed. We've all been to Levias. Well, I can't say we've all been to Levias, but many of us have friends, in the national religious world. Many of us have been to Levias. Many of us have been to Shiva houses. The war's been very hard. It's an emotional drain, and it's felt physically. I mean, myself, I could say the other day, I felt that the constant tension and emotional turmoil was beginning to take a physical toll, and I think we're not different than other people. There are those who are more isolationist and may think that this is some other community that this is taking place to, but I don't think that's the majority of the Haredi community.
Now, shifting to talk more generally about Israeli society, what do you look for in deciding which Knesset party to vote for? For a nice change of pace.
Typically, I've been a good little boy and voted for the Haredi parties. I think they're well. I don't. I'm an American. I was born in America. We believe in the privacy of the voting booth. I'm not going to talk about this
You don't have
one.
to say who you're voting for, but I'm
Yeah.
curious, what are the types of things you consider when you're deciding who to vote for?
Well, I think that defense policy has to be very important. Obviously, not staunchly anti-religious in rhetoric. I mean, I can't imagine how somebody who identifies themselves as a religious Jew managed to be a member of the Yair Lapid's party. That seems to me a little bit strange. But uh, you want, you know, there is not a great deal of debate in Israel today about the issues that once divided us. With the Oslo process, there was a major split down the middle of the country. That no longer really exists. So competence is an issue, and it's sad to say. I mean, given that Netanyahu must have been prime minister for about 17 years or more, that there seems to be a widespread feeling, anyhow, that he's the most competent person. If in a moment of challenge, that we feel safer with him in command, that there isn't anybody who conveys the aura of knowing what he's doing. He or Ron Dermer are probably the smartest people in the country, and have a sense of, have proven records of dealing with difficult situations and outlasting those situations. But you know, typically Haredim have been concerned with funding of school systems. Housing is becoming is a major issue for the community, and how that will be taken care of. Integration is also a major issue because, let's face it, the money is running out. We're now in the third or fourth generation in many families, many Israeli families, without an education, without an ability to get an education in this. It's not everybody is cut out to be an entrepreneur. I mean, there's plenty of money in the Karedi community too, but that's not most people. I'm an attorney by training, so I'm by nature a conservative guy who was trained to receive a large salary, not to go out and risk my own money and so forth. But you have to, you have to create those jobs, and the education, an educational policy which would say, for instance, we can never have separated classrooms, or we can never have college programs that would have sexual segregation. That's just a barrier to the further integration of the community, and it's something that would be very important to me.
Which is more important for Israel, Judaism or democracy?
Well, for me, obviously, Judaism is the I mean, if you say that these are a choice, I don't know that that's a choice, Judaism or democracy. I don't think that's I don't see that as a tension or a choice. But the Jewish people exist and have been protected, and the divine protection that we talked about earlier is a function of the fact that we are the people to bring knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to bring knowledge of God to the world. If we lose that, then we lose, what's our purpose? What makes us any different? Why is the collective existence of the Jewish people of importance? Israel does represent more than any other place in the world the collective existence of the Jewish people. So if Judaism flails here, or there's nothing that reflects that Judaism, then what's the point? What's the point of the state? Why should anybody sacrifice 3 years of their life to defend it? I mean, we're not defending a gene pool. We're defending a mission, and that mission is to bring knowledge of Torah and knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the entire world.
Should Israel treat its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens the same?
In what sense?
I'll let you qualify it as you'd like.
I think that Israel is probably better off as a democracy in which everybody has equal rights. Does that mean that you can never have anything that's that you can't have days, the public square that has a Jewish aspect to it, that you can't have days of rest which are based on the Jewish calendar? Of course not, because it's a large majority Jewish state. But in general, I think it's Israel. And the Karedi position is this isn't the final state, that this is not the Jewish state, and Israel is not the Jewish state. Whether Judaism can flourish here, whether Torah can flourish here, is, I think, essential to the long-range future of the country. But I wouldn't think that you should make distinctions.
Now that Israel already exists, what's the purpose of Zionism?
Does anybody know this? I don't think that. Are there still some Zionists?
You tell me.
I mean, I always tell.
Well, I guess let's start here. Would you say
my
you're a
first
Zionist?
Rebbe, Rabbi Aaron Feldman, you're always fighting against the Zionists. They don't exist anymore. I don't think a secular Israeli knows what does it mean, Zionism today. Zionism means more or less that Israel should continue to exist. I mean, that's really what will allow the continued existence of this the state of the only majority Jewish state in the world. That's really what Zionism comes down to today.
Would you say that you're a Zionist?
Listen, I was raised in a Zionist home. My grandfather was, in many ways, the maybe the largest contributor to Israel in his lifetime in the mid 50s. He passed away at a very young age, but Givat Mordechai is a neighborhood in Jerusalem named after him. The Chagall windows are in a chapel named after him. I was raised in a Zionist home. And I am proud of Israel. If that makes me a Zionist, maybe, but I don't. I
Well, meaning I ask because from your definition, it
because
seems like Israel.
today I don't think it's really an issue. Do I think that Jews should come and live in Israel? Yes, I do. But I think that on many practical, I think the future of the Jewish people will be in this country. I've seen the rise of anti-Semitism in America concerns me. If even on such a basic level as Iranian sleeper cells, terror cells, I think it's safer to be a Jew in Israel than it is to be a Jew in America today. And
Yes, I mean, the reason I was asking, because if Zionism is essentially just the belief that Israel should continue to exist, then is it like fair to say that essentially the Haredi community is Zionist today?
yeah, if you define it that way, but that's an intellectual trick. That's just a tautology. Yes, I mean, I think Israelis, many Haredim do take pride in the things that Israel does well. That we do celebrate, let's say, the skill, even the skilled army. I mean, we have to know how to talk about it in such a way that we don't fall into the trap of the kochi v'otzim yadi, with the strength of my hands, that I've done all this, and to understand that Hashem puts great ideas. I think even Jewish IQ, which is a very wrought subject to talk about, that there's in statistical terms, there's a standard deviation of 1 in Jewish IQs, and that they're in the upper realms represented something like sixfold over in IQs over 140. I can even see that's part of the divine plan too, because really, how does Paro start in Egypt? Let's come and deal cunningly with this people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the ability that we could deal with enemies for 3,000 years who were dealing cunningly with us. I think it's not an accident that Jews have produced so many original, innovative thinkers, and that Israel continues to do so. And I'm excited about Israeli biotech, these things do excite me to know that, if the cure for cancer, well, a lot of that research was destroyed at the Weizmann Institute this week, but a lot of things, the amount of benefit to humanity that comes out of Israeli institutions is a source of, I can't say pride because I'm not part of it. Somebody told me once, with respect to your children, don't say you're proud of your children. Say, I'm grateful. So I'm grateful for all these things. Proud. I'm glad to live in a country which is making such amazing contributions.
Mm-hmm. Is opposing Zionism inherently anti-Semitic?
Well, if you mean going to a demonstration, a pro-Iranian demonstration in Times Square and waving a Palestinian flag or an Iranian flag, that's an anti-Semitic. I think that I really think that the issue of Zionism doesn't speak to me anymore, because I don't see that there's such. It's not a movement. It's not. Zionism in its original form was a desire to create a new Jew. I mean, I think one of the people you interviewed was Anita Shapira, who was, the historian of Zionism, who said the whole idea was to create a new Jew who would be, exemplary in his martial virtues. He would be different from the yeshiva bacher in Europe, or the downtrodden Jew, and he would be martial and not so intellectual and so forth. We're not trying to create new Jews anymore. There's nobody who's wrapped up in an idea that Zionism has some alternative vision of what a Jew should be. But the Neturei Karta, they're anti-Semites. How could any Jew join a demonstration about a regime which seeks to kill Jews? That's unbelievable. It just shows you that any ideology has the potential to destroy minds and to blind you to the consequences of that ideology. I mean, there's a reason that Dostoevsky called The Possessed, the real Russian title is it The Demons. It's demonic. It's a demonic force when you get so wrapped up in an ideology that you can't see its human consequences, meaning rooting for a regime which seeks to kill Jews.
If you were making the case for Israel, where would you begin?
Well, it depends a lot on what was the case against Israel. I don't believe any of the case against Israel. Even all the things that people talk about today, colonialization. We are the least colonial country.
Well, it can be the case in any context in particular, but if you had to be the one who was making the case for Israel, and our listeners hate when I say this, but I'll say again, and I'll let you qualify that as you'd like, where do you think you would begin?
It's interesting because I once put together a 20-page proposal for Chris Christie when he was thinking of running for president or something. Somebody in Lakewood asked me to put together a 20-page description of Israel.
So you literally had to make the case for Israel.
I had to make the case. I talked about its humanitarian aid, its innovation, but in my private case, the case for Israel is the flourishing of Torah that's existed here. But if I were making a case to a larger secular or even non-Jewish audience, I wouldn't start there. But to a Jewish audience, in terms of the potential for Jewish flowering here, I think it is greater than any place. There's a reason why American yeshiva students come to learn in Israel for almost invariably coming for 2 or 3 years. There's something about this country, or Eretz Yisrael. It's very hard for me to separate Israel and Eretz Yisrael. They both they.
Why do you distinguish between the two? Meaning, when you say each word, what does that mean to you?
Well, Eretz Yisrael refers to the kedusha of the land of Israel. I don't associate Israel because Israeli founders didn't necessarily have that same sense. I mean, it could be that Ben Gurion said, where is my deed of title to the land, and put down the Tanakh and said, this is my deed of title. But the fact of the matter is, we bought the land. We're not a colonial power. We bought this land. Jews came here and bought land which is a largely uninhabitable and uninhabited land, and made it flower. I mean, its achievements are remarkable. I mean, I've been here. In the time that I've been here, I think the population of Israel has doubled. When I first came here in 1962 as a little kid, I can remember my uncle, who had been in the Irgun, could drive down the Tel Aviv-Haifa highway and wave to people on the other side because everybody knew everybody. It was a small, small country. And that it has flourished to this degree. I don't even recognize areas of Jerusalem which I once lived in. Things are built so fast, things change so fast. But and I am very comfortable and love my community too. I love I like the English speakers who came here because they were idealistic. They wanted to be part of living here. They wanted to make their lives in a majority Jewish country. And
is that case for aliyah harder or easier in the Haredi community? And I guess here we're thinking, maybe the yeshivish community or the yeshiva world in America.
Well, most come to live here at some point. They come to live here as, after marriage. It hasn't been as successful as I might have hoped. I've been speaking about this for a number of years in Haredi communities in America. Part of the thing is because family is so strong and people do not wish to be separated from their families. The same reason that Lakewood is too densely populated, and there could be a lot of places where in Kolim where people would achieve much more on an individual level by going out to smaller communities, many of which are flourishing and beginning to grow rapidly. But people want to stay close to their parents, which is nice. It does reflect something about the success of our family structures. But I'm lucky. I'm a very lucky Baal Tshuva because I'm one of 5 boys. 4 of us came to live here. My mother, when she passed away, had over 110 living descendants, all Jewish. almost all living in Israel, and so I'm lucky in that respect. My parents had the wherewithal to come here, and they joined us. We came, and they joined us. That's, I think, the obstacles are more practical because are more this familial. I don't want to leave my parents, but on a practical level, in terms of being able to afford health insurance, to be able to afford schooling, it makes a lot of sense for somebody, especially somebody who can earn a salary, an American salary, or use skills developed there. It makes a lot of sense on a financial level to come here. I think you can live a better standard of living in Israel and be surrounded in communities which are reinforcing. There are certain things that are not yet, that Americans and making aliyah could do better. We could have shuls in which were more shuls, which were more
similar to the
communities.
way that they operate in
Yeah,
America.
would be more communal, where a rav would, where there would be a rav. I've been very fortunate that the shul right next to me has had outstanding rabbanim. One of them, Rav Zev left. One of them, Rav David Miller. And now Rav Shlomo Klagsbald, who's the first native Israeli of the bunch. But, superb rabbanim. But that's not typically Israeli model. But I think we will build those shuls, and we will. If there were enough aliyah, there would be a change in the educational system too. There would be better secular studies. You do find that in Ramat Beit Shemesh to a degree that you might not. The alternatives, the range of options, would simply grow with more aliyah, which is one of the reasons why I'm excited about aliyah.
Should Israel be a religious state?
I think a lot of these things are left. I'm leaving that to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. I'm not interested in imposing. I am not interested in imposing my religious views on others. I'm not. I don't want to take away anyone's free will. I'm not. I do not want to be. I often ask people, if you see the modesty squads in Tehran find a couple on a park bench and beat them up, who do you identify with? You have to identify with the couple that's getting beaten up. I mean, I think so. I'm not interested in living we once lived in a time when God's presence was revealed, where to not follow the Torah was an act of rebellion. We don't live in that time anymore. This is not the period. This is not the historical period in which we live. We're going to have to do it by showing people that this is the best life, and the best life for a Jew, and the most fulfilling life for a Jew, not by legal impositions. Am I bothered by a Pesach law so that people don't bring in chametz to a hospital, for instance? That doesn't bother me. I don't consider that a high degree of religious coercion, but.
So I know that we said before that saying the Haredi community itself, or really any community itself, a misnomer, because no community is a monolith in such a strict way. But what do you think? I mean, from what you're saying, I guess my question is, A, do you think that your perspective and your opinion is shared or more popular in the Haredi community, quote unquote, in the broad sense? And if not, what is the Haredi community interested in? And again, I know saying the Haredi community itself is such a misnomer in building the state of Israel or developing it towards one direction. Because I think that from a political sense, there are politicians in the national religious Dati Leumi world or in other sects of the religious community in Israel who many perceive are in fact trying to create a religious state, which in itself can take many different forms.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I've met Betzalel Smotrich. I liked him.
Yeah, at least from perception-wise, that's how people.
That's just a term of denigration to say that he represents the messianic branch, or they're all messianists, and they want to bring Mashiach. I don't know national religious thought well enough to talk about.
Yeah, of course. Meaning, speaking, I think about the Haredi world, more generally, and at least what are the more common or popular opinions to encounter?
Okay. The only thing I can say about this is that I've been writing for 30 years. I have more than 2,500 columns. They haven't gotten rid of me yet, and apparently they think that my views are represent enough people who identify as Haredi, whether it's American Haredi or Israeli Haredi. I don't know if I'm really. I think I tend to speak more for an American Haredi community, uh, um, and maybe even more of a Balabatish community, maybe the Aguda community in America, than uh, than B'nai Brak, for instance. When I was appointed the editor of Yated Ne'eman in English, after being a Baal Tshuva for 10 years, I had only been to B'nai Brak once in my life. So it was quite a thrill to get to meet Rav Shach at that time, and even took my oldest son along with me. But I'm not, I didn't grow up in that community, and I don't grow up with its attitudes. I still grow up, I still hear the world through two ears. One, the ear of my families and those people I'd like to persuade that to take Torah much more seriously, and through the ears of a member as a member of this community. But there's always a certain ambivalence, and I'm happy with that ambivalence, and apparently it has an
Ambivalence
audience.
about.
No, I'm happy with the fact that let's say I could write a column 2 weeks ago talking about the failure of American education and how kids don't know how to read, and at the end say, there's something to be said for the Great Books program at Columbia, or the Great Books program that once existed at the University of Chicago, which is my alma mater,
Yeah.
by saying, who do you think is going to be more likely to, at one point, be open to hearing the message of Torah? Somebody who's thought deeply about what is the purpose of life, who's going to be more receptive to reading texts of debates which took place over 2,000 years ago. Somebody who's been raised in a tradition which starts with a Plato or an Aristotle, or somebody who thinks, oh, that's just dead white men and we only have to look at the most contemporary black thinker or something. I mean, it's obvious that I see in my own life, I feel that the education that I had, the secular education I had, I think made me more receptive to Torah, made it easier for me to.
So the reason that I want to press on this is because I think that, let's say as an example, with the religious Zionist community, is there diversity of thought? Of absolutely, and there are definitely different communities and different sects that have different perspectives. But if someone were to say that, in general, the religious Zionist community, of course with exceptions, maybe in the Gush and others, are interested in settling in Gaza, in expanding Yeshuvim in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, like that wouldn't, are they missing some of the nuance? Absolutely. But that wouldn't be an incorrect statement. And so what I'm curious about, at least I don't think that would be an incorrect statement. So what I'm curious about is that, in this sense, for the Haredi world in Israel, what is the goal then, if not a religious state as people perceive it? And whether or not that's correct is a separate question. Instituting more halacha into the law, or having halacha and Jewish law and informing the structures of Israel, then what is ultimately the vision?
Listen, there's almost no Karedi writing on that. These are almost untouched subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think these are really the goals. The goals.
So then, what are the goals? I
goal,
would ask.
to the extent there's a communal goal, is the primacy of Torah. That it is to create a community in which will allow for individuals to flourish with Torah as the central focus of their lives. If that can be in a larger context, the Jewish historian Jacob Katz always described Jewish communities in Europe that people derived their values from the internal community, but they also had interactions with a larger Gentile society. They had economic interactions. But where they derived their values and to where they looked for approval was in the internal Jewish community. I think that's going to remain true. I don't see that the Haredi community is very interested in setting a national agenda. They may be interested in an issue such as judicial reform, let's say. because they affect us. In other words, just one concrete example. A lot of the discussions that have taken place over the army issue have floundered on this point. As Rav Dov Landau, the Rosh Hashiva of Slobodka, said, I can reach any number of agreements with the army. And such agreements have been reached. But every time we reach them, the Supreme Court comes, or the attorney may not even get to the Supreme Court. The Attorney General may say, it's not shivyon, and therefore
Meaning it's not equal, or
it's not equal, and therefore it's
null and void.
null and void. And so they prevent any move towards accommodation. So that issue becomes very crucial, because once you remove it outside of the political sphere and make it a constitutional issue, even though we don't have a constitution, then you're making it much harder to reach accommodations which could be reached. So on that issue, the community has a stance because it affects everything. It affects the whole structure of the community. But I don't think there's much discussion about when we run the country, when we're the majority, it's not inconceivable, that at some point, given the differential birth rates, but it's going to be a very different Haredi community.
Why do you say that?
I once asked, I don't know if I wrote this column in the end, because a lot of my columns get stuffed in the drawer and don't get published. Would you want to live in a country run by Karedi? And that was my question. And I think if most of us are being honest, we would not want to live in that country right now. We don't feel competent to run the country. I wouldn't feel competent to run a war in Gaza. I wouldn't feel competent to allocate defense spending, to know whether you need more submarines or you need this.
So what do you mean that there will be a different Haredi community? And what do you think would be different?
Well, if I think as we've become larger, it is incumbent upon us to take more responsibility for the larger society, to see ourselves as real players here with responsibilities to our fellow Jews. I think as we've grown in size, that becomes far more incumbent upon us. And I think that I was involved in the establishment of something called the Haredi, Machona Haredi for Public Policy, the Haredi Center for Public Policy, which was established by Eli Pillay, who's the publisher of Mispacha magazine. And our opening statement, I think, which I drafted, was basically on this idea that we are no longer a small, beleaguered community just desperately trying to preserve its own existence. We are a substantial portion of 15% of the Israeli population and a growing percentage of the Israeli population. And as such, it's incumbent upon us to see how do we relate to this, to the larger. But there hasn't been a lot of thinking about that in the Karedi community. This is sort of, that was one of the first initiatives. It's not something that occupies too many Talmidei Chachamim, I'm afraid. You could have a Rav, the Rav from the Gush who had that statement with Ruth Gavison. He's a Rosh Hashiva in the... No, Yaakov... I forget. But he came up with a sort of something to deal with Shabbos. He put together something with Ruth Gavison, who was, not at all religious, but she was interested in how do we create a state where we can all live here together. Wolf always says, what is the definition of Zionism? A place where we can fight about what's the definition of, where Jews can get together to fight about the definition of Zionism. But
so the next question is one that's kind of surfaced a little bit over our conversation. Should all Israelis serve in the army?
A very large percentage of Israelis don't serve in the army. Yuli Edelstein's, who runs the committee in the Knesset that's dealing with the draft issue right now, said, there are large segments of Tel Aviv where you have a very low rate of turnout for the army. And he said, okay, listen, I understand that. He said, we can't have people who are not psychologically fit for the army. We don't want them in the army. But he said he proposed a law in the Knesset that those who get psychological deferments from the army should also not be able to get a driver's license. If you're not fit to serve in the army, you're probably not fit. You shouldn't be on the road. Who knows what your psychological problems, and that created an absolute uproar. It's not like everybody in the country is serving in the army. Disproportionately, it's the national religious community, certainly in the combat units, is way disproportionately represented, though it's traditionally been a glass ceiling for them.
Why do you say a glass ceiling?
To reach the upper echelons, that was always controlled. The ones who were too religious, one who said, let's say Shema before we go into battle, they find that their career in the army comes to a quick halt. I mean, that's known that there's a glass ceiling. In the junior officer corps, the national religious community is way underrepresented. But when you get to the senior levels, it's no longer the case, because that's one of the big threats in the eyes of the secular population. One of the big threats is the dominance of the national religious community in the army.
Right now,
I don't think.
yeah.
What do I think is the ideal situation? I think the ideal situation would be that the Torah institutions, which have developed over the last, I guess, almost 70 years now, that the intense Torah learning continue. I mean, army service is not necessarily a positive value. Like, this is the minimum thing you have to do to be a citizen, is to be in the army. At the same time, I think the community has to be sensitive to the issue: do we have enough manpower? Are there those who could serve in the army? What I cannot bear, which is the idea that army service should be something that should be looked down upon, that it should be something that you failed because you weren't in full-time learning, or you left full-time learning, or at some point your learning came to an end and you went out into the workforce. I have two sons
Within the Haredi community.
Within the Karedi community. I think that army service is something to be looked down upon. That's anathema to me. That's a personal view, and I don't know that it's shared.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that shared?
By many, but not by all, for sure.
So from the, let's say this is the
It should be said that, and Yeshua Pfeffers pointed this out in his research, that, even more than me. But Rabbi Eliyash, when I became the editor of Yated Ne'eman, I was still learning 2 Sidorim a day in Kollel. But I was told, you have to go register for the army now because you're getting a parnasa outside. This was from Yated Ne'eman. The voice piece in those days of Rav Shach is that anybody who does not qualify for an army deferment has to register for the draft. And I did. I mean, it wasn't relevant because I was already 38 years old. But I went down and I reported for the draft. I took the test. I was sure that they would see that I would make an excellent Mossad agent, but they didn't. And so...
So, I mean, it's interesting to hear you speak about the tension within the Haredi community between those who, let's say, leave learning to go to the army, whether temporarily or, for a longer period of time. But outside of the Haredi community, the main question that I think everyone's wondering is, what's holding the Haredi community back from drafting right now? Meaning, you've written in your columns, and I think, as you've said, many people have acknowledged, this is a multi-front war. The state of Israel is on the line. The Jewish people is on the line. It's, in many ways, life or death, beyond just an ordinary war. So, what is the reason for that?
It's not that you could suddenly draft all the Haredim and throw them into the army and they'd be ready to fight in this war.
Yeah, of course.
The groundwork has to be laid before the war starts, not afterwards.
Groundwork of...
you have to...
You're saying basic training?
Military training. I've always thought that there should be alternative forms. I would like to see... I always thought it was at least reasonable to talk about during Bein Zmanim, we have fairly long Bein Zmanim that people should.
It breaks between
the breaks between the yeshiva, the semesters. Let's say they call it the semesters in the yeshiva. That there would be nothing wrong with people getting military training. I mean, I can remember in 2000 in the second Intifada, which broke out just before the Yomim Noraim. I was always looking over the hill, waiting to see when the Palestinians were going to be coming here, and thinking, "Boy, I wish I had a gun. I wish I knew how to use it," because I was sure they were coming over the hill at the next at any moment. So there are a lot of communities, Kiryat Sefer, Beitar, they're surrounded by Arabs all around, and this is something where there should be movement towards organizing our own self-defense.
But isn't that particularly geared toward the safety of those Haredi communities in particular? And I think other Israelis and critics would wonder, why is there not that same type of concern for the greater state of Israel and actual serving?
No, I think they're
like, meaning essentially, like, I think beyond all the words that I'm using, the main question everyone's wondering is why are Haredim not serving, and to what extent is it justified?
Okay, one of the reasons is if you were going to talk about drafting all Haredim at the age of 18, then you've simply destroyed a social structure that's been built up over such a long period of time, which assumes that they'll get married 22, 23, which these are the most intense years of learning. It's just, a whole communal structure that's been built over 70 years is not something you can just alter overnight. The other danger is, have we created formats in which we could be assured that our children are going to stay religious? The record of the national religious community in this respect is not so great. I mean, of those who identify themselves as somehow religious, they went to Dati Mamlakti school, more than 50% don't remain religious in the course of the army. 18-year-olds are very susceptible to the larger environment in which they find themselves. They're very influenced by the larger environment. And you also have this issue, like Rav Dov grew up across the street. Rav Dov Fendel, he's a Rosh Hashiva in Sderot. He's written pieces. He said, the army says things to us, and then they don't follow up with that. And then they tell my students who are serving in the army that they're going to be in a tank with women. Do you know how you go to the bathroom in a tank? There's no privacy. You can't have it both ways. Are you going to make the army accommodate so that Haredim do not fear that their children will cease to be religious by virtue of going into the army or not? These are major issues. They have to be discussed intensely, and there are efforts. I mean, I'll be able to speak about this more in a few weeks, because I asked Yoshua Pfeffer to take me around on a tour of all the various initiatives that have started, the Hashmonayim Brigade and so forth. I was pleased to see in a little news clip I saw of the Hashmonayim Brigade, these did not look like dropouts from the Haredi community. They looked like fine young members who felt that they had a responsibility. And I do think, one of my sons pointed out to this, his son's in the Miluim right now. He told me, he said, many of us want to be part of Israeli society. Being in the army is part of being a member of Israeli society, even though, as I said, there's a lot of secular Israelis who don't go into the army either. But it's part of the Israeli ethos. And we want to be part of that. In other words, there are a large number of people who, in this building, we've had 10 young men who grew up in this building who have served in the army. I mean, it's an unusual building. It's an American building by and large. But it's not. Nobody ever had a problem coming home in their uniform. Nobody ever worried about coming home in their uniform, going back to a neighborhood where they might be greeted with hostility.
So I'm wondering, what would you say then? Because I think that it's in the media, it's very easy for many, and this has been my opinion for a while, to characterize and categorize the Haredim in whatever manner they'd like, because Haredim are not as present in the media space in general. So when people are writing and speaking about this issue as that Haredim are selfishly, in their description, selfishly concerned with their own religiosity and totally disregard the life and death of others and the country, what do you think that they're misunderstanding?
I think, the fundamental Torah view of all Jews being connected to each other, the preciousness of every Jew. And I think most Haredim, that is the Torah view. Anyone who doesn't share that view has something wrong with their Torah perspective. But it's not a lack of concern with, we live here. Israel loses a war, Iran hits us with a nuclear weapon, we're all gone. There's no difference between that nuclear weapon will make no distinctions between Haredim and non-Haredim. We all have our futures. We've made a large bet on this country. Made a large bet on Torah and a large bet on those of us who have come from Chutz La'aretz and made our lives here. But I did one time I was speaking in Baltimore together with Rabbi Moshe Tarragon, a Rosh Hashiva from the Gush. Mm-hmm. So we were supposed to speak on the Haredi national religious divide. So I said to him before, and I said, listen, let's do it this way, Moshe. I'll speak on the milas of the national religious community, and you'll speak on the milas of the Haredi community.
The milas,
what are the things that stand out about this community? It's outstanding aspects of each community, and that's what we did, and it was a big hit, and I got a whole column out of it. I just quoted what he gave a superb speech on the Karedi community. If you ask me what I do admire in the national religious community, one time my wife and I were in. I was davening in a Hesder yeshiva. I forget where we were. Where's the place on the big crater down south?
I'm not sure.
Oh, come on. Mispacha Ramona. So I was in I was there in the Hesder yeshiva, and I see the bookshelves are lined with Sifrei Hashkafa and Amuna. They prepare boys to go into the army and still learn a daf yomi and still keep learning, and it is admirable. It's really admirable. I think at the best levels of that world, the ability to keep learning and to learn in battlefield conditions under the most strenuous situations possible. There are things we could learn. We could learn how to educate our kids to preserve their faith outside of a narrow bubble, because many of us will be forced into situations, whether it's in the workplace. As I said, Haredim are going to be more integrated into the workplace too. You have to learn how to hold on to your identity in a place where you're not the majority.
Can questioning the actions of Israel's government and army, even in the context of this war, be considered a valid form of love and patriotism?
At a theoretical level, for sure. What has often astounded me in the questions about in the war is, this I say as an Israeli citizen, not as a member of the Karedi community, is I've often said that no matter what happens, no one we'll give Netanyahu any credit. We've decided that he's the great enemy, and there's no credit to be had for anything that he could do. No one seems to have noticed that Hezbollah doesn't exist as a threat the way it once did. That we're not subject to the same threats. That we degraded Iran's defense capacities already in October, so that they had no. Basically we've had free reign over there, and he gets no credit for anything. So if everything that you say is tinged with the fact we have to get rid of Netanyahu, in a time of war, I think you could lay off a little bit. But as Samuel Johnson said, patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels. So I don't want to. The argument shouldn't come down to that, but the fact that no one can give any credit, it's a shortcoming. It's a shortcoming in the country.
What do you think is the most legitimate criticism that's leveled against Israel today?
Well, now you're seeing my old Zionist upbringing. I I don't. The ones with respect to committing genocide is just insane, uh, and we're talking about against an enemy who is explicitly genocidal, who wants to kill every Jew. To think that, anybody who's looked at the statistics of the number of civilian casualties and the type of fighting that's being engaged in Gaza realize that Israel has done better than any army in a comparable situation. I mean, it's the 1-to-1 ratio of civilian to combat deaths amongst the enemy is unprecedented, as John Spencer has said, or Richard Kemp has said. I don't know. Oh, I mean, one criticism but it's an internal criticism, is that our judicial system is out of whack. That, as Richard Posner said about the former president of the court, Aaron Barak, he's a legal buccaneer. He's he basically seized power in a way that's absolutely astounding, and claimed for the court and claimed for the attorney general powers that didn't exist. It's a big weakness in our system, but it could be that there are not enough checks and balances in the Israeli governmental system. I once heard a group of very smart people, maybe Habib was one of them, but Yuval Levin, as an American political thinker, said Israel has a very strong society and very weak institutions. Does that delegitimize Israel? It doesn't. Is it something we have to work on? Our institutions do not keep pace with the resilience and strength of our population, which has proven itself over and over again. The people are better than the institutional system that we've developed. Maybe there should be different forms of Knesset representation. Maybe there should be some individual representatives. These are all issues that could be debated, but they're not the criticism that's being raised on the Columbia campus. They're not the criticisms that are being raised by the real enemies of Israel. I can't think of any that are illegitimate. I mean, I understand friends of mine, even a friend of mine from law school who owns a house in Israel. But I imagine if they see on the New York Times every day pictures of children in Gaza or the rubble in Gaza, they think, oh, how could we do that? But if the enemy has made their greatest publicity the centerpiece of their strategy to create as many casualties amongst their own people as possible, that can't be attributed to us. It's not because we're heartless. It's not because we want to kill mothers and babies and so forth. It's because we have to defend ourselves. We cannot have 80,000 people who can no longer live in the north or in the south because they're under attack. We cannot cede those areas. We're not a big country. We have a lot of population. We have to defend those. So I'm not aware of any criticism of Israel that's brought by the people who would like to see Israel gone that have any validity whatsoever.
Do you think the state of Israel is part of the final redemption?
I once saw an article long ago that said, I think it's dangerous do I personally, I'd rather remain agnostic. I don't know the divine plan. One thing I see is when you start talking, you focus on October 7th and you make a theology based on October 7th or Simchas Torah, and you don't expand that range to see what will happen in the next 18 months. I don't know the divine plan. I don't, we have a very, very, very bad record of predicting when Mashiach is coming and so forth, when the redemption is coming, even the greatest Jewish thinkers. So why should a Pitzkeler like me have an opinion upon that? Where the state comes, I do think the return of the majority of the Jewish population of the world to this small sliver of land is one of history's miracles. That, I'm sure, is one of the greatest miracles, that people who yearned to return to this small sliver of land and preserved enough of identity that they did so is a miracle and an aspect of the divine prophecies, that the land never flourished, that it, as somebody said the other day, it's the only country in the world which has more trees at the end of the 20th century than it had at the beginning. It's the only land which is flourishing in that way, in a way that lay desolate and bloomed. There's so much. There's so much that's exciting that's taking place here, and taking place on a religious level too. I am expecting this. I want to get in.
It's all going in.
I expect a major tshuva movement to take place as a result of the events of the last 18 months, but
Your
even
latest column.
of the last 12 of the events of the last 12 days. The 6-day war, even though the army performed so brilliantly, the Air Force, destroyed all the other air forces, but people saw, wow, something miraculous took place here. We've lived through historical times, and I think that Israeli Jews think of themselves as, okay, this is an important point. If you ask me what's the greatest achievement of Israel, it's that Jews here still think of themselves as Jews. They may not know much about it. They may not know much about Torah, but they have a consciousness of themselves as Jews. Meaning, when Omer Shem Tov went into a cave in Gaza as a prisoner, he started saying, I'm going to say Kiddush here. I'm going to become more Jewish. I'm going to say Kiddush every Leil Shabbos. He thought of himself as Jews, that an Agam Burger could say, I'm not going to cook for my Palestinian captors. I'm not going to eat on Yom Kippur. I'm not going to eat chametz on Pesach, and convince the other 4 Tatzpaniot that were with her that they also would not eat chametz on Pesach. If you put a group of Columbia students, the average group of Columbia students who had never been in one of the Jewish programs, you put them in a cave, they wouldn't start thinking about what they could do to make themselves more Jewish. That is something that has taken place here. There's a consciousness of oneself as a Jew, even though when it may not have much content to it, but still it's something that can be built on. And I think will be built on. I think we're going to see something amazing here in the coming years.
Is Messianism helpful or harmful to Israel?
I don't know what Messianism is, and I think it's always helpful for a Jew to know that there's an end planned, that the world is moving towards something, that the world has a purpose, history has a purpose, and it has an end game. Like the Ramchal says, there's a period for everything. There was a period where all people could have returned to the level of Adam Rishon. That ended with the Dor HaFlaga. There's periods, but everything has to have an end. We have to have an end to our lives. We have to know that we're limited. There is a goal. Hashem has a goal for the world. It's good to know. It's good to know that. But as one of my greatest teacher, Rav Moshe Shapiro, used to say, our job is not to bring Mashiach. Our job is to not get in his way. And that's a big difference. And so to know that we're part of a larger story, and to expand the lens is always good to know. But to think that to live with this consciousness that I'm going to bring Mashiach, that's more often dangerous than that.
Do you think peace between Israelis and Palestinians will happen within your lifetime?
Skeptical. I mean, because the educational system has been against peace. It's been to hate Jews, and as long as this idea that the Jew is an interloper here and has no place here, and never is, until there's an acceptance that we're not going to destroy Israel, let's live with it. But we did see the Abraham Accords. That is something big. And I think we'll see an expansion in light of this war too. I think that could expand. I think there will be peace with many Arab countries. And will the Palestinians come around? I don't know. I mean, because it's not that they can't sense that they could flourish more with Israel between 1967 and 1991. When the West Bank, the Judea and Samaria were under Jewish control, life expectancy jumped 50%, jumped from 48 to 72. Infant mortality dropped 3/4. 7 universities were built. It was the fourth fastest growing economy in the world in that period by 1991 when the Palestinian Authority took over. In tandem with Israel, if it's a mistake to look at other people and think that they think just like us and they're all they care about is material success. The radical Islamists have proven over and over again that that's not what they're looking for in life. When they brag, we love death, you love life. So we're talking at a different plane, and we have to take that seriously. Just like we have to take seriously when somebody says, we wish to destroy you. When Hitler said it, Yamach Shemo, we should have listened. When Ayatollah Khomeini says it, we were right to listen. And we should always be right to listen when people say that they mean to kill all the Jews. But we have seen, in my lifetime, I'm a pretty old man. My children's, I hope so.
Where do you identify on Israel's political and religious spectrum? And do you have any friends on the quote-unquote other side?
Close friends, I don't have.
Well, I guess let's start with,
I identify as a member of the Karedi community because my children go to Karedi institutions. I daven in several shuls. One of the shuls I daven in is, I would call, more American. There are a number of people there with kippot srugot. I go to shir in the morning where it's about half and half between the Rav is a product of the Karedi world, but it's just people who want to learn Torah together, and we feel very close to one another.
And politically?
Politically, I suppose almost all religious Jews, national religious or Haredi, are pretty much to the right politically, but right-left distinctions are increasingly less important in Israel because there's, nobody thinks we have a peace partner. I mean, very few people think that there's a partner for peace. Do I have friends in the national religious world? For sure. I mentioned Rabbi Tarragon. I don't know if I mentioned Moshe Capel. I have good friends, whose chasanas I go to, and in the secular world, as I said, I wrote yesterday to Chaviv Retagur and to Nate Vilf, who I was once on a panel with, because they say interesting things. They teach me things. I learn from them. I learn more about Israeli society. So I'd certainly like to be better friends, and it would work. When I find people outside of my narrow world, I'm eager to try. But that's my nature. I'm by nature an extrovert, and I wasn't raised insularly. I came from an outside world, so it's easy for me to switch back into that.
And thank you. And for our final question, do you have more hope or fear for Israel and the Jewish people?
Hope. Jews are by nature optimistic. When you know that there's a God in the world, we should be optimistic. We are still here for all the travails. As one of my law school friends once said, it hasn't been exactly a romp through sunny meadows. Jewish history is not just it's like an old Salem commercial. You're not just running through the meadows, but we're still here, and in many respects we're growing stronger than ever. So in both terms of the amount of Torah learning and in all the fields in which Jews continue to make amazing contributions.